I'm a god.
Well, what if there is no tomorrow?
I'm a god.
There wasn't one today.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Time to Rewind, a podcast stuck in its own time loop right along with the movies we discuss. In this season, we're taking a look at Groundhog Day after day, after day, after day, after day. I'm your host, Bubba Wheat from Flights, Tights, and Movie Nights, and in this episode, we're discussing Phil's February 2nd, Groundhog Day number 2, that starts at 18 minutes and 17 seconds with Sonny and Cher's I Got You, Babe, and Phil saying to himself that the radio station is playing yesterday's tape, and ends at 25 minutes and 21 seconds with Phil asking when the long-distance lines will be repaired and breaks a pencil in half before going to sleep with the clock flipping to 4:05. I'm here with my guest Robert from To the Escape Hatch and The Lamb. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on. Does not feel like a time loop, so I think we're safe. We're not stuck in this yet.
Yeah, and now, before we get started, I wanted to get your background a little bit with time loop stories in general.
So I would be interested to hear if you you may be this person, but I'd be interested to hear if you come across anybody that says anything other than Groundhog Day as their first time loop movie. I think there maybe is a couple things that predate it, but I don't think anything movie-wise, and certainly not as big as Groundhog Day. But yeah, I love Groundhog Day. As it took me a long roundabout way to say it, it's the first time loop movie that I can recall seeing, and I feel like there is like one a month now that comes out, or one a quarter or something.
Yeah, it definitely feels like that.
Yeah.
There's been several, too many that I can't keep up with. Like I'm excited to start digging into some more of these.
Mm-hmm.
Because even myself, like I don't have, like I'm not a time loop aficionado the same way that I am a superhero movie aficionado.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, like, I think Hulu alone has like two of them out. Obviously Palm Springs, I think, is the bigger one, but then Boss Level came out earlier this year, and then Amazon has, I think, The Map of Tiny Perfect Things or something, which I haven't seen that one. But
and Russian Doll was in the past couple of years on Netflix.
Very good. Which I guess it is getting a second season. I for some reason didn't think it was, and I think they maybe because I think they maybe build it as a limited series, but I think it is now getting a second season.
Yeah, and even video games, like just today as we were recording this, E3 is going on. I know we're about a month away from this episode actually being released, but there was an announcement for a new game from developer Luis Antonio called 12 Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a point-and-click adventure game with like a top-down style where it almost looks kind of like the Sims in a zoomed-in view.
Mm-hmm.
And the voice actors are James McAvoy, Daisy Ridley, and Willem Dafoe.
Right.
So it's got like big voice actors.
Right.
And it's interesting that they just had a trailer, and then there's also like a little developer video blog with him going through some of the gameplay. And it's basically like a standard point-and-click adventure game, kind of like the old Sierra games.
Mm-hmm.
Each time loop restarts whenever either your character dies or the 12 minutes timer goes off.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have different options based on what your character has experienced in the previous days. Like then in the first loop, like you're playing a man and then his wife, and then Willem Dafoe is a police officer that comes in through the door.
Mm-hmm.
And you can ask your wife what's for dessert, or I think one other option.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next time around, after the officer comes in, you can try to convince her that it's a time loop, or you can just ask her about dessert.
Mm-hmm.
And there's different interactions, so it's an interesting concept.
Just keep asking her about dessert over and over.
And like in the trailer, you see that, she has a present and an announcement that she's pregnant.
Mm.
Yeah, it looks really interesting. It comes out
Yeah.
like in August,
Hmm.
and it's something that I would consider playing, especially since depending on how this podcast goes. I mean, this
Hmm.
it'll be coming out towards the end of this first season being released. Maybe in the future do an episode on that. Maybe even
Yeah.
just like a bonus episode.
Yeah. I was gonna say at least do a bonus episode. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that because it's like every time loop movies are essentially just like video games. I mean, that's
Mhm.
to the point where boss level that just came out is essentially saying, yeah, this is just like a video game and there's a boss level. So it's interesting to sort of like reverse it back onto itself and just make a video game a time loop video game. And it'll be interesting to see how it's kind of like, well, every video game is like essentially like a time loop because if you die, you go back to your last save point. So why is this special? So it'll be interesting to see how that functions.
Right, and especially like I think it's more akin to old school video games that don't have the save point because you basically have to start from scratch every
Hmm.
time you play, and then you have to use your knowledge of the level. Games like Ninja Gaiden and Battletoads,
Hmm.
where you really had to know the level and
Hmm.
know to basically predict which what are the right moves because the game happens the exact same way every single time. There's no like
Right.
character AIs that change change what they do based on your actions. They all
Right.
do exactly the same thing every single time you play through, and you just have to use your knowledge to get farther in the game each time.
Right.
Bringing it back down to Groundhog Day and the loop that we're looking at, I would say that in time loop movies in general, this is one of the three most important loops in a time loop story. This is the first repetition,
Hmm.
and so this really shows you exactly where the milestones are and how the character reacts to this first time loop day.
One thing I wanted to say right out of the gate, and it's maybe more of just like not a critique per se on how that plays out or Bill Murray, but I almost want to say he's a little too aware at first. Like he's immediately like suspicious, and he's like, "Oh, you're playing yesterday's tape." He even recalls what they said. So he's like, my point there is like he's a little too aware at first. I feel like I would just like it would take me like 30 minutes to be like, this feels familiar. You know what I
But
mean?
I think it plays out pretty well, especially late as the movie goes on. We get to know that Phil has a good memory
Mm,
because he has to have a pretty good memory based on the things that he's able to learn and remember
sure.
because he has no way of keeping any information from one day to the next except for what he remembers in his own head.
Right.
And I think that it actually plays out pretty well because
Hmm.
he hears them talking, and I think that even in the 90s, I Got You Babe is the type of song where it's immediately recognizable,
Hmm.
but it's not something that they would regularly be playing.
Hmm.
So it would be a song that would stand out in your memory.
Hmm.
And so if he heard that the next morning, that I think that would stick out in his memory and
Sure.
he would remember what was going on. This whole movie, it's often been discussed that that Phil follows the 5 stages of grief
Hmm.
throughout the movie. But I think that he actually does it twice. I believe he goes through a very compressed 5 stages of grief in this day,
Mm.
and then he goes through the extended version throughout the rest of the movie. Because I think what you mentioned with him saying, "Nice going, boys, you're playing yesterday's tape,"
Right.
that is denial. Because he thinks
Right.
that the radio station just made a mistake and it's February 3rd, but they're playing yesterday's tape.
Uh-huh.
And it's not until they mention Phil where you see that click of recognition, and he's like, wait a minute, they're not just playing yesterday's tape,
Hmm.
they're specifically referencing Groundhog Day, and that's not a common mistake that a radio station would do.
Right. Yeah, and I mean for the audience, I mean that is probably where it starts to click for sure. And then I always love and wanted to call out particularly that it's more like a sound effect, but it's music. It's just like that creepy bit of music that plays. I'm not even sure how you would describe it, but that music that plays as he looks outside and sees that it's like the same day outside.
Yeah, it's like a wow.
Yeah, wow, wow, wow. Yeah, I can't even replicate it, but yeah,
And it does sound very 90s too, listening to it, but like 90s in a very complimentary way.
Sure, yeah. But yeah, I always love that because it's such a creepy way to fully signify that. So it's just such a great effect. But yeah, that's a great point about him. You know, the fact that he has a great memory. I didn't think about that, and it would be bad if you had a bad memory the second time because you have nothing. You know, you're like he obviously picks up like you were saying the piano and like ice sculpting and stuff like that. And if you just have terrible retention for that sort of thing, it's going to take you twice as long.
Right. Yeah, and then he goes out into the hallway, and then we see the repeat of the guy asking him if he's going to see the groundhog. And then that takes him into stage 2 anger whenever he grabs the guy and says, "Don't mess with me, pork chop."
Sure. Sure.
And then he goes downstairs, and then I feel like his conversation with Miss Lancaster, the owner, the manager of the bed and breakfast.
Right.
I feel like that is moving right onto bargaining stage whenever he's like, well, maybe this is deja vu. Like, did you ever have deja vu, Miss Lancaster?
I'll check with the kitchen.
Yeah.
Yes. I love her.
And then,
yeah.
And his chance of departure is lowered from 100% yesterday down to 80%. 75, 80%.
Yeah, that whole bit is awesome.
Mm-hmm. It's really, just a great moment. Like, I would say that this is, in general, one of my favorite days so far. I mean, it's easy to say so far because it's only the third day.
Right.
But this is just a really great day in general.
Mm-hmm. Well, so not to jump you ahead, but like, when does he get to acceptance? Because what is acceptance in this first run? Because
in this compressed day, I believe that acceptance is him breaking the pencil. Because that's him, like, it's a slight acceptance, like, if today is going to repeat, then this pencil won't be there.
Right. Well, yeah, he's like accepting that it's
the possibility,
right, to the point where he's like, I'm going to directly challenge it and see. And so he's like accepting that it's possible. But I would say for this first, not necessarily the day, but this first round of what you're talking about would be, I guess when he's driving with whoever they are, and they end up driving on the railroad tracks, and he's like, we can do whatever we want, not to completely jump ahead to another day, but
yeah. Well, that's just tomorrow's day.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm not jumping ahead too far.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know if you noticed, but whenever he does go outside and he asks the woman, where's everybody going? And she says, to Gobbler's Knob, it's Groundhog Day. That's the piano teacher. Yeah,
very cool. I did have that. That's my next note. And I'd be interesting, I'm sure you have, but I'd be interesting to see how often that happens, not even in a direct way like that. Because I thought that, jumping ahead a little bit more, when he's running into Ned again, it feels like the person behind him that is actually giving change or something to the homeless man, to the old man. I feel like that's somebody. I feel like that's, I'm blanking. I don't know his name at all. He's a great character actor. He's from like The Burbs. He plays like one of the drunks or whatever.
No, it's not him.
Is it not him? Okay,
No.
I was sort of like, is that him? But maybe it's nobody. But I wonder how often that happens.
Yeah, I'm curious because they do reuse a lot of the not quite extras, but like the speaking extras, like a lot of the minor characters do reappear throughout the days. Mm-hmm. And I am curious, like the piano teacher is a pretty notable one. because that's a character that you wouldn't expect to come back.
Right. Yeah, what I guess you definitely wouldn't know that at all, except for on subsequent rewatches, like, you know. So it's almost like a cameo within its own self in this movie, because you're like, oh, that's the piano teacher from later. Like, there'd be no way to know that.
Mm-hmm. And I think another like nice bit of physical acting that Bill Murray does is whenever he goes past the homeless man, and then he's checking his pockets exactly the same way that he did the day before.
Mm-hmm.
But then halfway through, he has just this moment where he's like stops and then looks at the homeless man, where it's like he has this realization that he did that the exact same way the day before.
Right.
And just this recognition of his own repetition, like his own habits, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at this at a micro level, that would be like one of the first instances of him seeing something within himself that he's not at the point where he wants to change, but it's something that he's noticing within himself that maybe is something that could be changed, or like he's realizing what he's doing, and like it's just the very first baby step towards change.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up an interesting point that I've never quite thought of, probably, is that there is no ultimate explanation, at least not behind the scenes. I think there is supposed to be, but there's no explanation for why this is happening and why it happens. But so he never, I don't think, has a moment where he's like, I've got to, you know, any other movie would probably, I think other time loop movies even say like, oh, you've got to change and you've got to be a better person and then you'll get out of this. But he never, I don't think, even thinks that. He just, I mean, he obviously does the opposite of it at first and just does whatever he wants. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, when he is trying to get that perfect day or whatever, he's not doing it to try to get out of the loop. He's just doing it because that's what he becomes.
Yeah, I have actually thought about that, and I think, and I'll probably bring it up again whenever I get to it, but it reminds me of The Good Place. Mm-hmm. And there's an episode in there where one of the characters doesn't believe that what they're doing is real, and then they're basically acting like Bad Phil. They're just doing whatever they want because they feel like the synapses firing within their own brain is creating this hallucination, and so none of it's real, and they're just like pushing people into pools. Mm-hmm. And then one of the other characters has a conversation with her and is like, let's just say that all this is within your own head. Mm-hmm. But even if there's a 1% chance that all of this is real, isn't it better to act like a better person rather than acting like a jerk? And that's what gets her to change as a character within the show.
Well, and so it's an interesting thing. You know, we talked about talking to Mrs. Lancaster, and that his 100% chance of departure becomes 75, 80, whatever he says. And it's an interesting and it's a funny thing for him to realize and change. And then the opposite of that would be when he's approaching the old man, and he does that same thing and catches himself. So it's like the opposite in a way, and like an interesting, you know, not callback, but like, you know, like duality of those two things.
I think this day in general is also really points out to him that he's living his life on autopilot. Mm-hmm. Because even though he is starting to realize that he's living the same day over again, he still steps in that puddle.
Right. Yeah.
Without realizing it, and like has that moment of, I should have known that I was there because it happened already.
Right. And then does, not to spoil another person's episode, but does it a third time the next day. But just completely runs off after doing it.
And, you know, the puddle itself is pretty crazy. This giant puddle filled with ice water. Right. And I do also love just the bit of, in the next scene, like you see him stamping his foot.
Yeah.
You know, as if his foot was just so cold and he's got to stamp it to get the feeling back into it.
Right.
And then stepping back just a little bit, the one thing that I noticed this time around, and especially like watching it multiple times, is I feel like Ned Ryerson's conversation doesn't entirely make sense as a first-time conversation. It feels it feels less natural than it did the first time because it's sped up and condensed and repeated because it has to be repeated for the audience.
Okay, interesting.
Ned Ryerson is like being right out of the gate.
Right, yeah.
I feel like that's not something that you would say if you're walking up to a high school classmate that you remember. Bing, right out of the gate. It's like, why would you say that?
Well, okay, maybe, so obviously he's like a salesman essentially, so he's probably got all that scripted out, you know what I mean? And just, he could say that to anybody and everybody all the time. So that could be why it feels like that. You bring that up makes me there's probably like an alternate draft of the script where like Ned is the villain and he's like essentially he's like why the time loop is happening.
Yeah.
And then, there's like an alternate ending where the camera pans over to Ned and he like winks at the camera. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I feel like, next to Phil at the beginning of the movie, Ned is like the next most horrible person.
Okay.
Within this movie, just his salesman attitude and just his completely unbridled glee whenever Phil Connors steps in that puddle. And it makes more sense in the first time around because Phil's being kind of a jerk to him. Like he's like, no, I've got to be somewhere else.
Right.
But this time around, he's just, he's not actively being a jerk to Ned. But Ned is still extraordinarily happy seeing Phil
just
step
annoying.
in the bill.
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting. Who is like the second most terrible character in this movie?
It's Phil, then Ned, then Larry, the camera guy.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say I would argue maybe that it's Larry because he is a real piece of work. Like you don't necessarily see it in our loop today, but yeah. But then after that, I don't know. It'd be interesting to like break it down like that.
I think most everybody else is pretty neutral, but
right.
There's just those three here are really pretty awful, and we do see a little bit of that with Larry whenever Phil asks Rita to slap him, and then he's like, I'll get the other side, the other cheek for you.
Right. What if maybe the kid that runs off after getting saved from falling out of the tree? He just runs off without thanking him. Not very nice.
Yeah, and I do think that Rita, whenever Phil asks Rita to slap him and she just immediately complies, I think that's very telling to what type of impression Phil made on her in just one day. And not even one day, but just basically one car ride. Like an hour and a half.
Right.
I believe it's about an hour and a half ride from Pittsburgh to Punxsutawney.
Bless her. Like an hour and a half in the car with Phil and Larry. Like that would be torture.
And it's obviously made enough of an impression that it's like, just slap me hard. It's like, okay, just right there. No,
she doesn't skip a beat. Just like immediately complies.
Yeah.
And the only other thing I have for this exact sequence here is like the polka song, which is like I've got you, babe, and then the polka song throughout the movie. I can't imagine having to hear that over and over again.
Yeah, and I didn't do a ton of research on the music itself, but I do know that the Pennsylvania polka is like it is a real song that exists, and it's been around for quite a while before, like in different iterations. And then getting back the one that to the stages of guilt, the one that we didn't mention, which I think is right about here, is depression.
Yeah.
And in the truncated version here in this day, I think it's pretty obviously when he just drops the mic and wanders
Yeah.
off and doesn't
Yeah.
even finish the rest of his broadcast.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Just the lack of interest, yeah, and even trying to finish that just completely gives up. Exactly.
And you see him just taking a couple aspirin without just completely dry.
Just a dry swallow, yeah.
And
Just another bit of like facial acting from him, or that is great.
And I think that's doubly effective because you see him put the aspirin in his mouth and then continue talking for several seconds, so you know that that aspirin is starting to dissolve a little bit in his mouth, and so he gets
Right.
the taste of that aspirin
Right.
in
And
his
makes that
mouth
face,
before
right.
swallowing, which really makes it that much worse.
Right.
Do you think it's because we do see the time on the clock? It says 4:04. Do you
Right.
think that it's 4:04 a.m. or p.m.?
I mean, I thought AM. I mean, that's a good question. I think it's got to be AM. That's what I was thinking, because wanted to point it out to be like, he's up so late. Like, what could he be doing?
But at the same time, like who is he talking to at 4:04 a.m.? Because I think the other
that's a good point.
option, because we don't see him, because he goes directly from the broadcast, which is, gotta be 7, 8 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 7. I didn't write it down, but he says that the time, it's like 7:30 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
and however many seconds whenever Phil comes out. So it could, I feel like this could be 4:04 p.m. And, even though the room looks dark, but you have a blizzard nearby, so it would be extra overcast, so it could be dark. And I feel like with the whole depression of him being stuck in here for an additional day, I almost feel like he's just trying to go to bed and in the afternoon to make the next day come quicker.
Well, so what don't we see him when he leaves the broadcast? What do we see? Don't we see him taking a shower with the cold water again? Or am I?
Yeah, we do see the shower.
Okay.
That's the only other thing.
And like, why would he take a shower unless he is like rinsing the puddle off his foot? But I mean, that's actually raises a good. I wonder if there is like a big deleted scene or something, because like, what could he have been doing the rest of the day? Unless he's trying to get out of town, which we don't see. The 4 a.m. and talking to something. I mean, is it stupid of me to wonder, like, he's got to be talking to an operator, and that's got to be 24 hours. But I mean, I'm thinking of like 1950s, 60s switchboard operator. I'm not sure when those in every fashion like went out of use. You know what I mean? But there's got to be somebody that's like.
Well, in the 90s, I would anticipate it's.
Yeah.
They still have like the 411, like the information operator.
Yeah. So it must be a 24-hour situation, or just like a goof on the filmmaker's part or something. That doesn't make any sense.
Just the way that the clock looked in the on screen, I almost thought that it looked like a non-working prop clock, but then I noticed that it actually does flip from 4:04 to 4:05.
Yeah, because I was like, I wrote it down because I was like, what? Why is it 4? Like, what's he been doing? And I guess he's just been thinking about like trying to figure out what's going on and making phone calls just to I don't know what, but
or just tossing cards into a hat to pass the time.
Yeah.
This is pretty efficient as far as storytelling goes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the previous day where he does everything for the first time around is just under 11 minutes long. And even though there's like 2 or 3 minutes of the blizzard stuff that they don't repeat in this one, but then this day is just over 7 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So we do get like a slight, it's a very good copy with just a little bit of time reduction. So we get a whole lot of the repetitive beats for us to know that it is an exact repetition of the previous day, but it is, I'd say, like a good minute to 2 minutes shorter. Just so we do get a truncated version.
Right. Well, because you'd want to. you know, we all know it's coming, so you've got to just establish that it is looping itself and then move on to the meat of the loops. So that does, I guess you're right. That does make sense that it's like about the same, just slightly less time, but because you just got to like lay that bedrock, in terms of looping and then move on.
Throughout the entire movie, there's a lot of disagreement with how long Phil is stuck in Groundhog's Day.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm asking everybody just to see what the consensus is.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say, like, how long do you think Phil's been stuck in this Groundhog Day throughout the entire course of the movie?
So I'm probably conflating two things, but I think I'm like a big IMDb trivia guy, and I think on trivia, the filmmakers, somebody involved behind the scenes says what they intended for the film to be. I think on the high end, and that might be like they were like, oh, we thought about doing this, but that was too long. But I think it's like 900 years or something crazy like that.
Yeah, I think the longest one, and I believe it was in an interview with Harold Ramis,
Mm-hmm.
just within a few years before he passed away.
Mm-hmm.
He said that, that the upper limit he thinks is that it was like 10,000 years.
Oh God.
Either 1,000 or 10,000.
Yeah, it's something crazy that I wouldn't have thought of. But I think there something else that's much more conservative that someone says, like
Yeah,
60
the other
years
one.
or something like that.
Yeah, he's also said that he feels like that Phil, like conceptually, that Phil would have spent like one entire lifetime.
Yeah.
So like roughly 40 to 60 years.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to be skewed by those, but like if I didn't know and somebody were to ask me, and I guess I just get the feeling that it's not even that long. It's just like I would, if you had to ask me and I didn't have any knowledge, I would say like 10 years or something like that. I don't have anything to back that up with, but and like you said, he's got a really great memory, so who knows how long it would take him to learn all that. Maybe not that long, but
yeah,
so
I think that does fall in line with what we see with him through just within the confines of the days that we see in the movie. Because for one, he has a good memory, and two, he takes a lot of shortcuts.
Mm-hmm.
So, he's not learning the entire French language. He's memorizing one French poem. He's not learning how to be an expert at piano. He's learning how to play 2 songs.
Good point. Yeah, and if you're learning how to do something specific like that perfectly, like you're going to pick up how to do it in general, you know what I mean? And like be pretty proficient in general with whatever you're learning with a specific thing like that.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I'm curious about is even with 10 years, we're only seeing 36 days within the movie. So there's a lot of days that Phil does that we don't see within the movie. What's one day that Phil had to have done that we don't get to see within the movie, like something that you would like to see, like a deleted scene?
Mm-hmm. Well, so now you've even touched on it, because I wonder, you've got like from whatever we said, like 9 a.m. to 4 a.m. You know what I mean? Almost like 24 hours missing on that first day. And I wonder, so before we got into that discussion, I was in answering that question, I'm thinking, I think if my memory serves, we only see him trying to leave once. Is that correct?
Yes, and then he gets stuck in the blizzard.
Right. And so the blizzard obviously is maybe going to stop him, but it's just like, and then my mind just got really dark here. Is there a deleted scene of him like frozen, Jack Torrance style out in the blizzard? In other words, like, did he try to escape and get out of town anymore? I think that would be my answer. Like,
yeah, I believe that there actually is a scene in one of the early scripts that he just goes outside. I don't remember if he's like, if they even go to the extreme that he's like just goes outside naked and walks into the cold, or at the
Mm-hmm.
very least he walks out, not dressed for the cold and just
Right.
goes in one direction and freezes to death.
Right. But yeah, would it so maybe be like a montage of days, but do we see him like, hitchhiking or on like a snow ski, a snowmobile? Do we see him on a crop duster plane, like just trying to get out of town? You know what I mean? That would have to be my answer. I'm assuming, like you said, that it is probably in like a version of the script, because like why wouldn't he try to get out of town more? That
Yeah,
would be
and you're right, it
yeah.
is, and surprisingly, it's we're only in like the third episode of this, but that's already becoming a common answer,
Okay.
is people wanting to see what happens if Phil tries to leave, and the script answer is that basically the blizzard is surrounding Punxsutawney on all sides, so no
Right.
matter which direction he tries to leave, he gets stuck in the blizzard.
Right. So is he in the sewer at one point? You know what I mean? Like trying to just go under the blizzard or something like that. So yeah, that would definitely be my answer as well.
Well, that's all of my notes.
Awesome.
Did you have anything else that you wanted to cover?
Not really. I mean, we hit everything that I had written down, you know what I mean? Like as all the way up to the time of him going to bed. That was like the kind of the last note that I made. So I think we about covered everything I wanted to talk about. Just like seeing Miss Lancaster's dialogue again. Um, and yeah, that would be the biggest thing that we hit was like the him being too aware that first when he first wakes up. But no, that's like we hit everything, I believe. I'm curious to see like all the other episodes and the discussion on all the other loops, but we hit everything I wanted to touch on.
All right, sounds good. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you. Yeah.
And, for anybody else that wants to see your other work, where can they find you online?
So totheescapehatch.com is my website, my pop culture blog, and it has actually been I think the last time I posted on there, unfortunately, was January of last year, and it's even been kind of like a bone of contention lately. The 10-year anniversary of totheescapehatch.com was like May 16th, and I just blew right past it. I've had every intention of doing something. And the biggest thing I would do on there, on totheescapehatch.com was, and I think you wrote for it, Favorite Scene Friday. I know you did, actually. It's been so long.
Yeah.
Just as it implies a favorite scene, and we would just kind of write why a classic scene from usually just a movie, and why it kind of resonates with you. But I don't know what the statute of limitations is on celebrating a 10-year anniversary for a pop culture blog is, but I might get around to doing something else there for that. But that's pretty much where anyone can find me in terms of a .com. But on Twitter, I am at Zerbert. If you kind of want to follow along with me there. And actually, if I do anything these days, it's I guess almost like a little Twitter segment feature that I do, that I have kind of dubbed. I've been doing it for a couple of years now. Fear of Better Films, where I kind of start 3 different movies. I watch the first 15 minutes of each, and then just sort of whichever one I deem like is the best, and whichever one I kind of want to finish, I go with that. And oftentimes I will kind of finish them all, but that actually came out of a very practical thing of just like there's so many good movies these days that I can't. It's like if without doing that, I will just watch nothing. I'll just like scan Netflix and not put anything on. So I just had to take
Just
action
browse
there.
Netflix for 2
Yeah,
hours.
exactly. And just I've kind of turned it into. I mean, no one else cares, but I kind of do it on Twitter, and it's kind of fun to kind of chronicle it. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
think in terms of the anniversary, as long as you do it before the end of this year,
okay,
I think you're good.
okay,
And that you reminded me, I started my site not too far from you. I'll be coming up on my 10-year anniversary for Flights, Tights, and Movie Nights.com here in December.
oh awesome,
So I gotta myself remember to do something
yeah.
special for that, which,
Right.
you know, hopefully I am in the process of writing reviews again, so the
Okay.
site's being active, and then there's this podcast, so at least the site is coming back to life. So because I know a lot of people that I met blogging, you know, in the early years of doing my site, have kind of fell off on their own blogs and podcasts, especially last year for obvious reasons.
Yeah, sadly. Yeah.
But hopefully things will be getting back to normal here sooner rather than later. And speaking of my site, I am Bubba Wheat from FlightstightsMovieNights.com. You can find me on Twitter at Bubba Wheat. And this podcast, It's Time to Rewind, you can find it on Anchor.fm. And you can also find it anywhere else hopefully anywhere else you can subscribe to podcasts. You know, I'm still working on, I'm still in my own Groundhog Day time loop of figuring out how to end this podcast. So here's to the next loop.
I'm a god.
Well, what if there is no tomorrow?
I'm a god.
There wasn't one today. Do you ever have deja vu, Mrs. Lancaster?
I don't think so, but I could check with the kitchen.